There we go. We see people joining in. Well, welcome everyone. And today, this is our third webinar on the revisions of the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. And I would like to thank the UNCDF, the United Nations Capital Development Fund, for hosting us and acknowledge the presence and involvement of key stakeholders in the region, such as the Caribbean Digital Finance Alliance, which has been actually instrumental for the submission of our comments to the Financial Action Task Force after our last webinar during the consultation process. So my name is Annie Bertrand. I'm a financial inclusion expert, and I'll be your moderator for today. Also recognizing the presence of the TTIFC, I think are joining us today, the European Union, which is the donor behind the UNCDF program in the Caribbean, and other regulators that are joining us today. So we will cover today the final publication of Recommendation 1 and discuss the financial inclusion guidance, which has been also issued by the Financial Action Task Force and currently open for feedback during this consultation process. And we have today three amazing global experts. We'll also touch on the second proposed revisions of Recommendation 16 on travel rule. And this is not about traveling on a plane, but it's for traveling, the travel of funds, digital funds in particular, which is also open for comments. So before I invite them to share their perspective, I would like to welcome Dawn Spicer. She's the Executive Director of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. The CFATF plays a critical role in building regulatory capacity in our region. So I'm excited to have the Executive Director with us today to do the opening remarks. So Madam Spicer, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annie. Good day to everyone. I understand that you're all probably in different time zones, so I think good day would probably be a good introduction to everyone, depending on where you are. I am certainly pleased to deliver opening remarks at this important webinar being hosted by the United Nations Capital Development Fund, which will focus on raising further awareness on the changes to the FATF Recommendation 1, which deals with the risk-based approach, and the guidance that will be developed in that regard, as well as the proposed changes to Recommendation 16, which currently deals with wire transfers and more specifically the travel rule, and of course the impact on the issue of financial inclusion. In addressing money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risk, there is an ongoing need to ensure that anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and proliferation financing frameworks have measures that will both address and mitigate those risks. It is necessary to have a practical balance that protects financial systems from criminal abuse, while at the same time allowing a high level of access by as many underserved people as possible. This, I believe, is what financial inclusion measures seek to achieve. This balance is important because where population's availability to banks, banking services, and products is limited, the risk of underground or illegal banking or money transfer arrangements increases substantially. Populations in developing or low-capacity countries are at the greatest risk to be financially excluded, but at the same time are often most in need of the services and products that could help alleviate their circumstances. Additionally, financial inclusion increases the ability of law enforcement, supervisory bodies, and others to monitor transactions that put financial systems more at risk of being infiltrated by criminals. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, continues to focus on areas of AML, CFT, CPF that can be abused by criminals and criminal organizations. As you're aware, the most recent approved changes to the FATF standards have been to Recommendation 1, with the impetus on ensuring that measures are in place to allow financial institutions to implement simplified measures as appropriate to promote financial inclusion. Of course, the proposed measures are reliant on the implementation of a risk-based approach that will ensure that any simplified measures are proportionate to the risk. Also being deliberated are the proposed amendments to Recommendation 16 and the travel rule, that is, the information that should accompany payment messages. The UNCDF, along with the CFATF and others, are focused on providing cogent feedback and recommendations to the FATF so that the proposed measures will not negatively impact the ability of low-income persons, merchants, or underserved persons such as migrant workers to be included in financial systems. You attending this webinar here today are privileged to have the views of financial exclusion experts who will provide you with all the important information on the financial inclusion impact of changes that have been made to Recommendation 1 or will be made to Recommendation 16 of the FATF standards. This is your opportunity to address how proposed changes will result in a better balance between strong AML-CFT measures, but also allowing for equal access and opportunity to those that are currently underserved by the financial sector. I wish to thank the UNCDF for its continued involvement on this issue, which is of importance to the Caribbean region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don Spicer, for your welcome remarks. And we're happy to have you and I hope that you will stay to perhaps comment later on in the discussion and also ask questions. And I would also like to ask the audience to post in the chat their questions as well as we move forward, because we will try to address them as the experts speak. So at this point, I would like to invite Mehmet Kers, who I had the pleasure of working with during our capacity building activities at Sheltrum Banks in the region, to do his presentation. So he's not only familiar with the international regulatory framework, but also quite familiar with our region, having worked with him in the Caribbean. So Mehmet, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Dawn. Can you see my screen? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see.
It's on there. And okay, that's great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's great to be here, and thanks UNCDF for organizing this webinar. So you can see still see the screen, right?
Yes.
Because I'm having a hard time. Let me try to change.
Yeah,
okay,
that works.
Okay. Thanks again. In terms of the content in this presentation, this is the list. What are we planning to cover as the CGAP team? I, Louis, and Ivo together. First of all, we will start with the CGAP's involvement in the integrity agenda of FATF, Financial Action Task Force. Then we will shift to discuss the FATF's recent inclusion related initiatives, including FATF has revised on the recommendation 1. And then we will cover the key features, the key issues, and our observations on the draft financial inclusion guidance, and also proposed revisions to recommendation 16 on travel rule. These drafts were published in the last week of February for public consultation. I'm referring to the draft revised financial inclusion guidance and the proposed revisions to recommendation 16. And lastly, we are planning to briefly mention the other work FATF has been doing regarding the financial inclusion. So let me start with the CGAP's involvement in the AML-CFT agenda over 2 decades. So CGAP is housed at the World Bank, and its focus is advancing digital financial inclusion around the globe. So financial integrity and AML-CFT issues are important for CGAP because in many cases, these have impact on financial inclusion. And these issues, AML-CFT related issues, have impact on low-income populations, They have impact on financially underserved and excluded people. CGAP has been involved, as I said, CGAP has been involved in the integrity agenda for more than 20 years. And we have been supporting FATF's Financial Action Task Force work from a financial inclusion perspective. Luckily, we have Louis here, who has been with CGAP during this journey. So back then in 2011, FATF drafted financial inclusion guidance, and CGAP was part of the project committee, and that 2011 guidance also informed the approaches to simplified due diligence when the revised 2012 standards were adopted. And also CGAP supported the revision of financial inclusion guidance in 2013 and again in 2017. And CGAP also contributed to the guidance, financial inclusion guidance, with examples of good regulatory practices added to the guidance. Similarly, CGAP supported different work of FATF, including drafting of FATF's digital ID guidance. As far as I remember, it was published in 2020. And also FATF's important work stream on unintended consequences of FATF standards, etc. And CGAP was also very recently, was also part of the project team working on the revisions to Recommendation 1 and the revisions on financial inclusion guidance of FATF. So, as you know, FATF is now under the Mexican presidency, and one of the key priorities of the Mexican presidency is to advance financial inclusion. And the president intends to do that by promoting risk-based implementation of the FATF standards. And she wants to do that by promoting more proportionality for the AML CFT measures implementation. Also, the president keeps highlighting that the financial integrity and financial inclusion objectives are not conflicting objectives, they are complementing each other. And recently FATF revised Recommendation 1, and the latest version was published on February 25th. And this work was part of the FATF's program to address the unintended consequences of FATF standards. And this program has been started in 2021. And I can say this work intends to understand whether and how the issues arise because of the incorrect implementation of FATF recommendations, FATF standards, etc. And the revisions to Recommendation 1 brought us to actually the draft revisions to the existing FATF guidance on financial inclusion. And FATF has published the draft guidance for public consultation on February 25th. And the public consultation will be open until April 4th. But in parallel, by the way, the FATF also launched the second round of public consultation for the draft revisions to Recommendation 16 and its interpretive note. And the deadline for that public consultation, for Recommendation 16 is April 18, 2025. So, as I mentioned, recently there were some revisions to Recommendation 1. So as you know, FATF has 40 recommendations, and the Recommendation 1 is one of the most important one, and it focuses on risk assessment and the implementation of risk-based approach. And one revision is about the implementation of simplified due diligence on lower risk scenarios. And as you know, many smaller countries have chosen not to allow simplified due diligence in lower money laundering and financing terrorism financing risk scenarios. And as expected, this leads to overly strict compliance measures by regulated entities, regulated institutions, financial service providers, etc. So to address this issue, FATF promoted the full implementation of risk-based approach, and it revised the language of recommendation 1. So regarding the lower risk areas, the wording has changed from countries may decide to allow simplified measures to countries should allow and encourage simplified measures as appropriate. So recommendation 1 is now using more forceful language, and this new language is welcomed by us, by CGAP. The other revision is, as you see in the second row, about the low risk situations and exemptions. So FATF recommendations allowed countries to exempt certain types of regulated entities from some measures. For example, from due diligence in strictly limited circumstances, and provided there is a proven low risk of money laundering, terrorist financing, and prohibition financing. But the term proven was seen as a higher bar, and requiring more than just an appropriate risk assessment. So that's why many smaller countries choose not to apply the exemption. So basically, to address this issue, the revisions to recommendation 1 deleted strictly and replaced proven low risk with assessed low risk. So basically, this is to clarify that countries may rely on, I don't know, for example, their national risk assessment, their sector risk assessment to reduce the compliance burden on low risk entities. And another revision is on the supervision side. So the revisions to recommendation 1 also include amendments on the supervision. So basically, it requires supervisors to review and consider the risk assessment and risk mitigation measures conducted by entities, for example, financial service providers. So basically, with the new revisions, supervisors are also expected to review the risk mitigations measures done by the financial institutions. Last but not least, the other revision is about the non-face-to-face business relationships or transactions. So for a long time, I can say since 2003, FATF classified non-face-to-face business relationships. I mean remote relationships, digital onboarding, for example, digital transactions as potentially higher risk. But now the revised recommendation 1 is now considering non-face-to-face business relationships and transactions as higher risk if the appropriate risk mitigation measures have not been implemented. So let me shift to the FATF's draft financial inclusion guidance details. So the draft guidance, first of all, is a long document, and it's as far as it's more than 120 pages, and the proposed revisions are in line with the revisions to FATF standards, including recommendation 1. And the draft guidance also has increased focus on proportionality and more focused on simplified measures under the risk-based approach. And one of the most important revisions is on the definition of financial inclusion. So FATF, I need to highlight that FATF has now a new definition of financial inclusion, and then The new definition not only considers the access to financial products and services, but it also includes the appropriate usage of those financial services and products. So the new definition includes both the access and usage, appropriate usage of financial products and services. So let me stop here and hand it over to Louis. Louis?
Thank you so much, Mehmet. In general, our observations around the guidance is that it represents a very positive step forward. We are particularly happy about the broader definition of financial inclusion. Bringing in usage also puts the focus, for example, on compliance costs that are generated that leads to increased fees for services, thereby forming barriers to access. But there are still questions that remain. For example, the approach of the document is very much that the risk-based approach will solve the financial inclusion alignment problems with FATF's financial integrity objectives. But the FATF standards also have a number of rule-based measures, for instance, in relation to targeted financial sanctions, in relation to terrorist financing and proliferation financing. Those measures, when implemented by countries, may also be over-designed. They may also be overly conservative when implemented by institutions, thereby forming barriers to financial inclusion. And yet the document recognizes that in a sentence, but places that outside of scope. And for us, that is a gap that would really be helpful to address. Furthermore, risk assessment measures were introduced in relation to proliferation financing in 2020. And yet the document focuses on money laundering and terror financing risk only. No mention is made of proliferation financing. That is also a gap because institutions need to manage and respond to all three risks. Frankly, a customer has the risk profile that's determined by the highest of the three. So focusing only on two of them and not on the third also leaves gaps. In general, the risk-based approach is powerful, but we've also seen that major questions arising around what risk is and how best that should be identified in terms of levels, that is not really clear. FATF's own national risk assessment guidance is inconsistent across its three main documents because it hived off its national risk assessment guidance over the years into three documents, one focused on money laundering, one on terror financing, and one on proliferation financing. But the risk concepts and the methodological guidance differs at a conceptual level among the three documents, which complicates the identification of lower risks and hence the application of simplified due diligence. And yet there are really major strides made in the document. The document, for instance, positions not only simplified due diligence, but also a tailored approach. It's recognized that some excluded people find themselves in circumstances that cannot be classified as lower risk. And FATF is conscious and wants to give guidance on how best to respond to the risk inherent in those relationships without unduly causing financial exclusion. Mehmet, the next slide, please. So in general on gaps, the document uses the term financial exclusion risk, which we think is really powerful, but it's not particularly clear on how it understands financial exclusion risk. Now, on the one hand, financial exclusion risk is simply the risk of not being included. But what does this risk mean in relation to FATF? Because the FATF standards themselves employ financial exclusion as a tool. And targeted financial sanctions exclude those people targeted. Under recommendation 10, if you can't perform customer due diligence appropriately, you have to terminate the business relationship. So that's exclusionary, but then it's used as a tool. So where's the line drawn between FATF using financial exclusion to advance integrity and financial exclusion undermining FATF's integrity objectives? We have a lot of examples around risk-based approaches. None of them are indicated as FATF compliant. They are provided as examples and they are helpful. But yet, once you've read the 120 pages, it's still not clear on when, for example, a terror financing risk is lower. Because the document still warns small payments pose a terror financing risk. We understand that. But does a $50 terror financing transaction pose a lower risk than a $500,000 terror financing transaction? We don't have clarity on that, and that makes it difficult for institutions to identify risk levels in relation to terror financing, and even more so in relation to proliferation financing. Lastly, Mehmet pointed out the important new revision of recommendation 1, allowing for supervisory review, not only of money laundering and terror financing risk assessments, but also risk mitigation measures. That's really helpful. But what does that mean? What does review mean? Because we've worked with many supervisors who've refused to second guess risk assessments or risk mitigation measures. Mehmet, the next slide, please. Lastly, on needs, I've pointed out issues that we'd like FATF to attend, but there are also things that FATF requires the financial inclusion community to do, and that is to contribute more institutional examples of sound, simplified due diligence from banks and microfinance institutions, good examples where they feel that simplification is working well. Mehmet also pointed out the revision regarding non-face-to-face transactions and the addition that they're not higher risk if their appropriate risk mitigation measures are employed. What does that mean in practice? Who has good examples of what they believe are appropriate measures that could be included in the document? And then lastly, to the supervisors, what are good supervisory practices regarding this review and response to institutional risk mitigation that can be incorporated? Next slide, please, Mehmet. So that is focused on the financial inclusion guidance. But it's also important just to briefly touch on the consultation around recommendation 16, and which is now in its second round. It started last year. Now, from a financial inclusion perspective, what is particularly important is FATF's requirement for party data, both the originator and the beneficiary, to be included in the payments message that falls within the context of recommendation 16 that will now be broadened to value transfers too. So currently, there are 3 broad fields of data, and the third one has a number of alternatives. Last year in their proposals, they unpacked the alternatives into 3 different fields. But there was concern also expressed by CGAP, also expressed during our UNCDF previous engagement with this topic with you, that was going beyond what is realistic for many developing economies. So they've just published a new set of proposals, and they've listened. I think that's one really kind of big benefit we've got at the moment. FATF does listen if it's engaged. So firstly, the initial idea of 2024 to have the full name included has been revised to name, because full name can be very extensive in certain cultures globally. Secondly, I want to point out to residential or business address required of both the originator and the beneficiary. That still remains the same, that it would only be required if there is an address, and in the absence of an address, the country or the town name. But I want to add that a little condition has been added. FATF realizes that many people would struggle even with a town name, especially on some islands where there may not be a town but just an island, or people in deep rural areas. And they want to issue non-binding guidance on how institutions should respond to those factors. In the second last line, if the originator or beneficiary is a legal person, they wanted specific official registration number or other registered numbers. That is now also becoming optional. It's only required where that information exists. And then finally, if the originator is an individual, the date of birth of the originator. Now, in the last three cases, they are all starred. All will be subject to the non-binding guidance. And I just want to kind of raise the concern that these measures will be packaged into standards that will be employed in systems of banks globally. It's not quite clear how non-binding guidance will be sufficient to bring in the flexibility in IT systems that will handle these measures. We think that the measures should be slightly harder and be inbuilt in the standards to have effect. Mehmet, thank you so much. Last slide on recommendation 16, very briefly. So we've had a good positive effect on recommendation 16. There are some risks, but also some support for financial inclusion. Some of the risks: cross-border cash withdrawal is still a new measure that's included. That is, if someone travels across the border and withdraws cash from an ATM in the neighboring country, then information from the bank or institution has to be sent to the bank operating that ATM. And that's going to be costly, and we're not quite sure that that will have a big effect that is proportionate. But lastly, they also want to build in confirmation of payee or alignment of information checks, payment information with the actual beneficiary data. That could actually add more comfort for users. Unfortunately, it will only apply for transactions above $1,000, but the additional comfort may actually lead more users to feel comfortable and be using these electronic payment systems, especially with the spate of mistakes being made and scams currently. Thank you, Mehmet.
Thank you, my colleagues, for the great covering the points on what is happening at FATF. You all see that it's a lot, and you all see it's very consequential. In fact, this audience is very special because it has lived through many consequences of AML CFT requirements being implemented, through the consequences of overcompliance and de-risking. So it's a great opportunity to speak to experts like you who are particularly sensitive to the changes in AML CFT standards, and who can also, the audience that can also very meaningfully inform the current ongoing revisions and the consultation process, both for the financial inclusion guidance and the recommendation 16 revisions. I just would like to reiterate that the guidance is meant to be a useful tool that helps policymakers and financial institutions fine-tune their AML-CFT requirements so that they well balance integrity and financial inclusion objectives. It's meant to be practical, and I believe that FATF genuinely tries to bring the guidance and the standards closer to the principle of proportionality and complementarity with the ongoing work. Is just very important for the financial inclusion experts and the financial integrity experts provide the necessary input so that it's reflected well in the guidance. And that's why we're holding this webinar. That's why we've published a series of blog posts, and most recently, as of this morning, a briefing note analyzing the revisions of guidance to help review the documents and provide a meaningful feedback. So we hope that you can leverage those resources to your own benefit. Now, my role is just to very quickly reiterate the other areas where FATF is working. One is already mentioned recommendation 16 revisions, the second round. The public consultation is open until 18th of April. So a month from now, they will be closing the revisions. And I think it's very consequential area and very consequential recommendation to review and provide feedback because the implications for the payments, international remittances, and by extension, the financial inclusion are immense. And so it's important, again, as my colleagues already mentioned, to provide comments and also highlight good examples. Where the good examples do not exist, highlight the non-existence of good examples, because what we're seeing is that on one hand, there are standards and frameworks that allow proportionate risk-based implementation of AML-CFT standards. On the other hand, we also see a hesitation to explore to the full potential those frameworks, and we see a lot of conservative and risk-averse approach towards implementation. And so this should be highlighted along the root causes for such a risk-averse approach, and maybe put some more encouragement to experimentation with new ways of implementing risk-based approach and proportionality. So besides the recommendation 16 revisions, there's going to be a private sector collaborative forum that will be held in Mumbai next week. CGAP is actually trying to organize a similar initiative on our own, trying to bring the discussion about recommendation 16, recommendation 1, and the guidance revision closer to the markets that are likely to be highly affected by those revisions. So just keep following our social media and cgap.org for more information, but the plan is there to have a similar round of consultations virtually. And then, as mentioned already, there are revisions on recommendation 1 that's been already posted online. So the new version of recommendation 1 and interpretative note to recommendation 1 can be now accessed on the FATF website. So is the amendment to the national or amended national money laundering risk assessment guidance that was published in 2024. So very active. A lot of this effort is meant to advance financial inclusion or help to balance integrity with financial inclusion. But again, it's absolutely crucial for the people who have direct experience with the unintended consequences of AML-CFT standards to share their experience openly. Mehmet, next slide, please. And that is maybe just to reiterate that we not only encourage you to review those documents and submit your feedback by April 4th and 18th, respectively, but also we stand ready to continue this engagement in this kind of setting with multiple stakeholders, or even bilaterally if you want to. So you can either contact us directly, or you can also use this address we have set up for the purpose, which is aml@cgap.org, where we're very happy to, again, engage bilaterally and set up follow-up conversations. You can also share with us draft proposals or draft feedback for FATF if you want for further consultation. Just explore it the way you want. And with this, I hand the microphone back to Annie, but I would like to also encourage you to use the chat function and raise questions and points and comments as you have them, so we can address them in the rest of the webinar. Over to you, Annie.
Very good. Thank you so much, Ivo, and thank you, Luis and Mehmet, for this presentation. But I have many questions for you, so don't go away. I would like to first start by saying, like, why do we care about all this? Why do we care about everything you just mentioned? I mean, for us in the Caribbean region, more than 80% of our MSMEs do not have a bank account and cannot process, well, maybe have an account somewhere, but cannot process digital transactions, which means that these MSMEs are excluded from the digital economy. And we also have a large proportion of individual adults that are excluded. That's why we care. And why is what you're talking about important for the purpose of banking and providing digital financial services to these MSMEs? Well, obviously, the regulators in each country is being audited and influenced and must be complying in their supervision to the standards of the Financial Action Task Force, right? So just to step back a little bit, if just to make the process clear, the regulators conduct a risk assessment in their country, and they define different risk scenarios. When they're determined that there's lower risks, they may encourage the regulated financial institutions or fintech providers to say, well, this is lower risk, so therefore you can use simplified approach to customer diligence, meaning that you don't need to have to provide your letter of employment, you don't need to provide 10 different things. It's simplified customer due diligence, so therefore lower requirements for onboarding, right? So that's basically stepping back a little bit. So I just wanted to ask you now, you can clarify what I said, but also what is lower risks? So for example, and what's the intent of risks here we're talking about? So we're talking about money laundering, that's very clear. Weapon of mass destruction, that's proliferation financing. And we want to reduce also the risk of terrorist financing. So this is what we're trying to prevent ultimately. So my question to you is, when we're talking about lower risk, are we talking about the person making sure that when you buy bananas on the street, you're paying your taxes on it? Are we talking about, I have a boat with tons of cocaine that I want to put into the financial system? So what is the intention of the Financial Action Task Force when they determine their standards and want to assess lower risk? What kind of risk are we talking about? First question. Mehmet, Luis, Ivo. Who's going?
If I may jump in on the risk, Ivo, you could come in on the inclusion impact. But Annie, the FATF standards initially focused on the drugs, so that boat with the cocaine. But since then, it has broadened to all types of crimes. So it broadened to tax offences. Much depends on the country and the regulator and how they perform the national risk assessment. But in reality, it's not only the country that determines that, because the country's banks need to do business with foreign correspondents. So for the Caribbean, it's also important to look at what American banks require and what they do. And what we've seen during the years is everyone adds their own risk until it becomes this huge mountain of risk. And everyone becomes reluctant to identify lower risks because, yes, it may be a lower drug risk, but is it a higher tax risk? Is it a higher other risk? Is it a risk that we haven't thought about yet? And FATF has taken an important step with the revision of recommendation 1 to say, be conscious of lower risk. It's forcing countries to think and identify what the lower risks are. But that's why it's so important. That's why we're pressing for, give us examples. What do you mean by lower risk?
Right.
So we're also looking for that answer. You're asking precisely the right question for this time. So good on you.
And the mitigation, the measures proportionate to these risks, these measures, what kind of measures are we talking about? Are we talking about measures related to the onboarding requirements? What kind of measures are we talking about that could be proportionate to the risk?
Ivo, perhaps over to you.
Yeah, so I'll just start with where you posed the first question with the risk. I think, and that's speaking from my own point of view. I think there's a huge discussion that is really due, maybe overdue, about the risk appetite, and if the implementation of AML CFT standards means zero risk and zero failure rate, or whether there is some level of risk appetite that is acceptable, and whether that risk appetite is different for money laundering versus terrorist financing versus proliferation financing. Having more clarity on that, as Louis already mentioned, would be very useful, because in your example, obviously the target is the drug trafficking, but the unintended consequences then impact on the merchants selling the bananas on the street. And is it what we want? Is it or are we willing to take some risk in order to promote, for example, higher formality of and better financial access of micro and small entrepreneurs? Now, for the mitigation measures, the mitigation measures can be implemented across the whole KYC process, depending on the risks identified. And they can really vary from asking for additional documentation, asking for the additional documents, not only for identity, but for the business transactions or the transactions involved, the frequency of different controls. There are different mitigation measures, and there's this concept of residual risk, right? So you have an inherent risk, you apply the measures, then you have some residual risk that remains after the measures are applied. What that risk is it acceptable, and how you treat it. That's the whole concept of risk management, where individual approaches would be informed by the individual risk assessment. That's why the national risk assessment needs to be complemented with the institutional risk assessment, because there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And partially the problem that I think we're seeing is that we are implementing one-size-fits-all solutions. We are trying to implement wholesale solutions rather than recognizing there's such a variety of situations where people may be caught in higher standards without really posing the actual risk to the financial system. And I would like to see more of the experimentation. I would actually want to see some sort of sandboxing that would allow more sort of risk-taking but safeguarded experimentation with how AML CFT standards are implemented, explicit incentives for policymakers and institutions to take on that risk in a limited setting, because otherwise everybody's kind of locked in this game of trying to avoid any possible shortcomings and failures, out of the fear that there would be regulatory consequences, but that doesn't really bring much progress in this field. So again, to state again that we do have the framework, the risk-based approach is already there, and I think it's very clearly saying that there is a range of measures that can be applied based on the risks identified. But so far we've explored mostly the enhanced measures side of the spectrum. We now need to explore a little bit more that lower risk spectrum, and we cannot do it on our own, right? That has to be an effort where policymakers, hopefully in collaboration with FATF or FATF-style regional bodies, come up with solutions that they then test and become a standard for others. And that's my last point, which is, to me, it's very telling that in the guidance, when we look at the examples of good practices, there are very few of them. And even those few, they are relatively limited in the approaches. For example, the tiered KYC approach. And even for those limited good examples, there's even more limited evidence of their positive impact on financial inclusion. We should be asking why 10 years after the first version of financial inclusion guidance was issued, we don't have plenty of those examples that would vary in approaches and would showcase how different risks could be matched by different measures. We should really be asking that question and try to change it so that the next iteration maybe overflows with good examples.
Yeah, and I really like the revision also that recommends that the supervisors should be reviewing the risk mitigation measures that are used by financial institutions or non-banks to make sure that there's no over-compliance, that when there is lower risk, hey, these people should not have enhanced due diligence. These people should be allowed to have access because it's lower risk. We have determined that. So I'm happy about this, but I'm not sure it will address the problem in the Caribbean, because some of our regulatory our compliance officers or regulators are aware or already review the risk-based approach of financial institutions. The financial institutions already have a risk-based approach with the 3-tiered KYC structure, but they're not using it. They just use enhanced across the board because they don't bother. So requiring the supervisors to review the risk mitigation measures established is one thing, but I think we should also require them to report on it officially, because I was also told that sometimes the board of directors of the banks, if the board of directors of the banks were told by the regulators, hey ho, you're not implementing your risk-based approach, you're only using enhanced due diligence according to the supervisor's report, maybe they'll be more motivated to address the situation. What do you think?
By the way, I used to be a bank examiner, bank supervisor in the past, focusing on AML, CFT, and prudential supervision. I agree that it's great that supervisors are also now required to review the risk mitigation measures. This is the new responsibility. This is great. But where tiered CDD is applied by the regulation, for example, if the regulation has this tiered CDD structure, the supervisors should also look at these issues, whether tiered CDD is actually implemented by the regulated entities, by the financial institutions. So this could be done by the supervisors during the on-site and off-site supervision. This is one thing. In addition to that, the regulator can also implement, I don't know, guidance, more encouragement to the financial institutions to adopt this tiered approach, where there's a tiered approach, by the way. And also, I want to mention that while the draft guidance refer to the risk mitigation, the supervisors need to, examine the risk mitigation measures. The draft guidance does not really provide any clear guidance on how the supervisors should actually review that risk mitigation measures applied by the financial service providers, regulated entities. So in this call, if there are regulations who have some examples and, who have some guidance on that, how the risk mitigation measures can be supervised by the supervisors, please feel free to provide examples to the FATF.
Yeah, Mehmet, maybe we can provide officially the example. We have to reach out to the ECCB, but they have put into the legislation a basic bank account requirement, and they have defined those risk mitigation measures very clearly with some boundaries along with the banks themselves. And now it's going to be mandatory for the banks to offer basic bank accounts. So we can talk about it offline later on to perhaps bring this example, which is a good one, I think. It's a very good example also of collaborative approach between the regulator and the financial sector. But I have one last question, and then I'm going to open up for the audience. So my last question is about the exemption. Mehmet, you talked about, I think it was you who talked about the exemptions for, so just to make sure that FATF standards allowed countries to exempt particular types of regulated institutions from some AML, CFT, CPF requirements, but in certain circumstances, strictly defined circumstances. I want to ask you, could food security, could farmers be exempt from these measures for KYC, along with their cooperative institutions, financial institutions, given that this is a particular situation, food security, we're talking about small farm holders. Could that qualify as an exemption? Could we make the case for it before FATF, you think?
Before that, maybe I also need to highlight that FATF recommendation 10 actually talks about customer due diligence elements. So in that recommendation 10, FATF has like 4 elements on customer identification, customer verification, risk monitoring, and transaction monitoring, as Ivo mentioned. So first of all, I need to mention that financial service providers in many countries has the flexibility to conduct simplified due diligence for this kind of segment, this kind of lower risk farmers or other types of customers. So the financial service providers can actually apply simplified due diligence to this segment. For example, I don't know, for example, for customer identification, these farmers can report their ID, give their identity information or something like that. But for example, the financial service provider may not have to verify this kind of information. So for example, because it could be hard for this kind of segments, this kind of customers. So in that case, so it means customer verification is simplified. And also the country itself also during the national risk assessment, or we can say sector risk assessment or subnational risk assessment. In different countries have different names when it comes to the risk assessments. During their risk assessments, if they they think that this is low risk, there could be some exemptions. So this is actually technically possible. But when I say the country is doing, when does the national risk assessment or sector risk assessment, it's not only about the regulators doing the national risk assessment by themselves. The national risk assessment or sector risk assessment should be done in collaboration with the regulators, with the financial service providers, fintechs, customer associations, fintech associations, banking associations, etc.
Only when there are 3 people in the team, that is, as all these detailed risk assessment has to be done as well, for sure, in collaboration with all these stakeholders and quickly. Ivo, you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to add to it very briefly that, interestingly enough, during the COVID times, we did see application of a wide range of exemptions and simplified measures because it was recognized as an important thing to do to get people money under the specific circumstances. So there's a lot that is possible. If the political will is there, we actually written a piece about that specific, the emergency measures. It's just that what we're really looking for is more permanent systemic solution, and in that sense I'm not sure the exemptions would necessarily be what we are looking for. Right.
Thank you very much. Mehmet, you still have your hand raised. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to add one more layer difficulty to the discussion actually. And FATF, as you said, refers to low risk and low risk terminologies. But in our latest briefing note, we just published it today. One of the issues we are raising is, okay, we are talking about the low risk and low risk. This is great that FATF has this and explain these terminologies. But what is the tolerable level when it comes to low risk and low risk? What's the reasonable level to consider for low risk and low risks? And FATF might need to provide more guidance on that. That would be useful for financial service providers and also for regulators themselves.
So in summary, Mehmet, if we had the regulators who had the capacity to conduct proper risk assessment at the national level, sector level, define the tolerance for and define clearly the guidance for the lower risks, group of stakeholders and the segments. Then they provide this guidance to the financial institutions, and then hopefully that would help financial institutions to implement the risk-based approach, hopefully considering that they have corresponding banking relationships to maintain as well. But okay, so we'll open up for questions. I would invite, if we have regulators in the room, to comment and to ask their questions first. But before I do so, one last question for Louis, actually. I just thought about, Louis, when you were talking about recommendation 16 on the travel rules and you were providing the list of documents and requirements for traveling with the financial information, I was wondering if this requires also validation, because it's one thing to provide, or I think also Mehmet also mentioned, it's one thing to worry about the name of the town where the person lives, but it doesn't matter if we don't need to validate it. It just matters if we require a justification to prove it.
Yes, validation is required, not of all the fields, but basically the originator's details need to be validated, needs to be accurate. So it needs to be validated by the originating institution, and the beneficiary's details need to be validated on the receiving side. It doesn't go for all of the fields, but that certainly adds to concern. And we deal with countries where there's very low levels of birth registration, and therefore, how can the date of birth be verified?
Great. So we'll open up for questions from the audience. Can somebody want to raise their hand? Somebody has a question? Do we have questions in the chat? A bit too long for me to read. Any questions and comments from the audience? Tunde, I can see Tunde. Tunde, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me first start off saying that I am not an expert in this field. I've just gotten into this and I'm learning. But I do have some questions and observations. I am from the Caribbean. And one of the biggest concerns that I see, I hear we talking about FATF and all the regulations, but I know the difficulty is that it's very difficult to set up bank accounts. It's very difficult to do business in the Caribbean, despite all of that. And I think that, taking Barbados and the Caribbean as small island developing states, banks, commercial banks in particular, they have a really, really high dependency on their correspondent banking license. And a very good partner of mine, who is a CEO, expressed the concern. They acknowledge the lower risks associated and the possibility, but if they don't have a correspondent license, they lose their business completely. So at the end of the day, it has to be a focus. The focus is while you might, and I'm paraphrasing for them, is while there might be lower opportunity, it's a significant business risk from their perspective. I'm not sure what can be done. I'm not sure if this is a high level of fines and stuff like that that's going to go on and take place. But losing a correspondent license for a local bank is literally a death trap, a death sentence.
Yeah,
so I think people prefer to over-regulate at the end of the day, despite all the different options, than to lower it and risk losing it. So unless there's something that can be done at that level to give them comfort, I don't think you're going to see much change in the Caribbean.
Louis, you want to take that? We had talked about this before, you and I, with Donald Trump. Maybe that. Go ahead.
Yes. Look, the financial inclusion document touches on debanking, de-risking, over-compliance. Those are all very important concepts to position in this financial inclusion guidance. It's appreciated what devastating effect this has on businesses that are excluded, but it's also realized that businesses are over-complying because they're exposed to regulatory risk. But after the document recognizes that, the question is, does that really help regulators to change their approaches? Or do they still feel that the same drivers, though acknowledged now, still remains in place? We know a lot depends on what American regulators do, because they levy particularly big fines. That causes specific angst in the global financial community, and that cascades throughout the system. Will this guidance change the way in which banks and their regulators think, and the way in which regulators interact with one another? Guidance on their own and on its own will not achieve everything, but will it empower us to, in our engagements, and you in your roles, to be agents of change and a changed approach? Does it provide a better vision of what a better system could look like? These are questions that I think are very important to have at the back of your mind when you read the guidance document. And if your answer is not a certain yes, then what can be done in the remaining time? And we've got 2 weeks to make submissions on what can be done to strengthen the document to provide a higher level of comfort.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, very good, Luis, good answer. And also, what I realized from my experience working in the Caribbean, I also realized that sometimes the headquarters or the senior leadership of financial institutions and non-financial institutions like fintech would be more comfortable allowing simplified due diligence, knowing that is within specific, clearly defined boundaries defined by the regulators. So when the regulators can define those boundaries more clearly, it makes the headquarter in the US more comfortable with, like, just to give a clear example, proof of address is not part of the legislation. You don't need to have a proof of address to open a certain bank account or a certain account. It's not in the legislation, but the headquarter in the US may say, well, we use it normally, so we're requiring it. But if the regulators define that this is not necessary for this type of account, then it makes even the corresponding banking relationship perhaps easier. Mehmet, go ahead.
So I actually, to add Louis' point about the de-risking, I just wanted to highlight again the draft inclusion guidance, as we mentioned, that recognizes the risking and the banking as a factor that impacts financial inclusion, and the risking, and highlights that the risking activities actually contradicts with the risk-based approach. And as far as I remember, in Annex 1, there are a few examples on how a few countries' initiatives actually address the risking in their respective jurisdictions. So this part can be looked at by the regulators and other competent authorities. But also, I just wanted to mention that these examples may not be enough. So that's why we have the public consultation. So if you have any, better examples and better solutions, please provide FATF with these examples.
Mm-hmm. And Luis, you also had something else to add, sorry.
Very briefly, in a sense, let's cut to the chase. When is a terror financing risk lower? We can speak about all the great things that can be done, but if we don't have clarity about that, where are we going with the system? And FATF, in fact, is including in recommendation 16 the warning that even small transactions pose a risk. And yes, they got a threshold of $1,000, but do minimize that because of the risk posed by small transactions. If we can't use value, what do we need to use? And without that clarity, and terror financing from 2001 has been complicating this field. Previously, everyone knows what's a big money laundering or a higher risk money laundering transaction. It's the more valuable one. Everyone focused on value. After 9/11, it became blurred, and we're still dealing with those questions. Let's get solutions now. FATF can provide us with greater comfort, because we speak about comfort, about risk tolerance. And a country can only be comfortable about the risk that's tolerated by its main trade partners and their banks. So we need to have a broader regional and a broader trade discussion, and FATF is the ideal forum for that. But for that, we need to press for that discussion to be had. Thank you.
That's why we're lucky to have you gentlemen with us to share this knowledge and highlight and mobilize the comments. Yes, thank you so much. I think I'll take one last questions or comments from anyone in the audience if somebody want to raise their hand. Otherwise, we will close here. Maybe after this webinar, I will ask, there's specific items, Mehmet, you mentioned you would actually really appreciate, because I think that CGAP will be submitting some comments to the Financial Action Task Force. So some specific examples do you wanted to ask the FinTech community to provide comments on, for example, the non-face-to-face onboarding requirements. So we'll provide a list of those aspects that is clearly in your blog to ask the community to provide some examples and comments on this. I think would be very useful. So we'll follow up on that. And on that note, Edward Mefrano, I would like to invite you to do the closing remark for us today.
Thank you so much, Annie, and everyone else. I think in the interest of time, allow me quickly to extend warm thanks to all our panelists, Mamet, Ivo, and Louis. We started this conversation a long time ago, and I'm happy to see that it's continuing. I also want to thank our participants who are online. Some are physical in our office here in Trinidad, but we have quite a lot of following online. So I would like to thank for their audience. I also want to thank colleagues from the UNCDF DFS4Res program, who have also been truly engaged and involved in organizing this webinar. But as I lightly said in the beginning, to say we started this conversation between November and June last year, where we had the first engagement or discussion on the travel loop, and then we looked at the recommendation 1. Both of these actually emphasized on the revisions that FATF is proposing, but also sorting reviews or comments from people within the financial ecosystem in the Caribbean region. We are happy as UNCDF to see that not only have we been able to make submissions from within the Caribbean, but we have also attracted a lot of comments from the globe. And at UNCDF, the Digital Financial Services for Resilience Program, we are very excited to see that we are making these submissions and influencing the revisions for the TFAD as we proceed. I mean, in the past, we have also observed that collaboration is quite important as we try to influence these recommendations within the financial regulatory ecosystem. So I want to encourage all of you who have participated today and continue to participate that please make sure that you make your submissions, you keep on getting involved, join the conversations, but also explore how we can leverage these regulatory changes in order for us to advance financial inclusion and continue to work together in a financial ecosystem that is, first of all, secure, inclusive, as well as resilient. So I don't have much to say other than once again thanking all of you for your participation, and I look forward to continued collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much for the speakers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.